So good evening everyone and welcome. Special welcome to Heidi and to all of you. It's really wonderful. We're mostly here to hear her story, but it always takes its context as part of our Erev Yom HaShoah service, which is not really a service, it's just to give it a context. So there'll be 5-10 minutes or so of us just preparing to hear testimony, to hear Heidi's story. And also we'll be lighting 6 candles to remember 6 million before we hear from Heidi. But first, if I say we begin with silence. We begin with silence, the silence of death, the silence of life, the silence after destruction, the silence before creation. There is only silence, the silence of Job, the silence of the 6 million, the silence of memory. On this day of Yom HaShoah, we remember the most devastating episode of our history. From year to year, it recedes a little further into the past, but the magnitude of it remains beyond our comprehension, and the pain of it beyond consolation. We have a duty to remember, for the sake of those descendants who survived them, so that they may know that they are not alone in their sorrow. For our own sakes, so that we may not be blind to the evil of which human beings are capable. And for the sake of future generations, so that they may consider well what is needful to prevent such a Shoah, such a destruction from happening again to our people or to any people. And so we light 6 candles in memory of our 6 million dead, who died when violence ruled the world and evil dwelt on earth. And as we light these candles, we commit ourselves to remember those we knew and those whose very name is lost, to remember and never to forget. Can I invite you all to stand and our 6 candle lighters to come forward? Zachary, you first.
As we light the first candle for the first million, we also remember the hundreds of Jewish communities, the richness and vibrancy of Jewish life that were destroyed during Shalom.
As we light the second candle for another million lives, we also remember the parents who fought to protect and save their families until they could no longer do so.
As we light the third candle for another million, we also remember the children who were brutally murdered before they had the opportunity to take life.
As we light the fourth candle for another million, we also remember the ghetto fighters, those who rebelled in camps, partisans, and the armies who through their efforts aspired to maintain life and dignity.
As we light the fifth candle for another million lives, we also remember the great teachers, the writers, the poets, the artists and musicians who retained their humanity.
As we light the sixth candle, marking 6 million, we also remember the non-Jews who suffered with us, those persecuted, and those who took it upon themselves to save those who were persecuted, often paying for their actions with their own lives.
So with these 6 candles, we commit ourselves to remember the 6 million. We commit ourselves to responsibility for one another, to build on this earth a world that has no room for hatred, no place for violence. Together we pray for the strength to fulfill this vocation. Please sit down. So it really is my pleasure to introduce Heidi, or actually not to introduce Heidi, because we're going to take 45 minutes or so before some questions as well, for Heidi to introduce herself and tell us about not just her story, but herself as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening. Today is the day when we commemorate the 6 million Jews who were murdered. Now, every year, the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, as I'm sure most of you know, suggests a theme to help us to remember and to think about how and why could this happen. And this year's theme is the fragility of freedom. Now, when I heard that first, I couldn't quite connect it. I didn't really quite see how that was related to the Holocaust. But then I got it. Because racism of every kind, and anti-Jewish racism is probably the oldest racism in the world, going back more than 2,000 years, and it never quite goes away. All racism is an attack not on what we do or have done, but on who we are. And the Holocaust showed us very clearly how fragile that freedom was, the freedom to be who we are. And I'm going to tell you the story of 2 families whose freedom to be who they were was seriously challenged, with very different outcomes. Both families were Jews. One of the families was mine. So I'm going to start with my story when I was 4 years old. Where is the...
So it's not a thing. I can either press for you, or it's this button in the corner is next.
That,
But
I'm going to
want me to do
ask
it?
you.
I
Yes.
with pleasure. I know my job.
Okay. So please, if you could put up the first slide now.
No, I said I would. Right, it will happen.
You're going to see a slide of me when I was 4 years old, because that's my story starts. I can't remember anything before then, but I do remember this day when I was 4 years old. Be nice if we could get it. Shall I go on, or shall we?
Carry on, we'll find it in a minute.
Yeah, okay.
It
Suddenly,
came in beautifully before we started.
suddenly there will be a picture of me when I was 4 years old. Okay, so I was out for a walk with my father, and it was a lovely day, and we were chatting away. My father was a lawyer. He was a defense lawyer. He defended people who got into trouble and couldn't pay much. And he was very happy with his job. He loved it. And it was a beautiful day, and we were chatting away. We were on our way home when a man, a client of my father's, ran up to us. And he stopped in front of my father, and he yelled, "I'm not going to pay a dirty Jew." And then he spat at my father, and he ran off. And I cried. And my father comforted me, and he said, "Jews are not dirty. But there are people who don't like Jews, and that is called anti-Semitism. It's a new word for me. But I knew what it meant. It meant that people didn't like me because I was a Jew. Now, we lived in Vienna, capital of Austria, you all know. And Vienna, of course, you should... Oh, you see, you've got a picture of me at 4 years old. Wonderful. Can we have the next one, please? There we are, it's just a map of Europe, just to show you how central Austria is in Europe. Right in the middle of Austria, and right in the middle of Europe, and surrounded by 7 other countries. And one of those countries, of course, the biggest, is Germany. And when I was 4 years old in 1933, Hitler and the Nazis came to power in Germany. And things were pretty tough in Germany. There'd been the Great Depression in 1929, and there were still bits of it happening. There was incredible unemployment. There was awful inflation. I mean, a loaf of bread could cost the equivalent of £5 now. People were sick. There was no health service. The country was in a perilous state. And Hitler, of course, had already written a book about Jews. It was well known he didn't like Jews, and he blamed the Jews for everything that was going wrong. It was that version of conspiracy theories, of fake news, of misinformation. And people believed it because they were having a tough time and they wanted to blame somebody. And the Jews are easy targets because we are a recognizable group of people. So anti-Semitism spread in Germany without a check. And they were able to make anti-Jewish laws, the Nuremberg laws, which made Jewish life very hard, almost impossible. And because Germany was so close to Austria, the adults were always talking about what was happening in Germany. They were always talking about anti-Semitism, so that I grew up with that word. And anti-Semitism was spreading in Austria as well, and again remained unchecked. So of course the adults were always talking about it because they feared that what was happening in Germany just could happen in Austria. Now, we were an ordinary family. Well, maybe not quite ordinary, because my father grew up in a little town in what was then Moravia, which is now Slovakia, in a little town called Pohorlice, Porlitz in German. And it was a very particular town because ever since the 18th century, when it was first established, there had been an equal number of Jews and Gentiles. And very early on, they decided that they could live together and that they would have a Jewish mayor, a Gentile mayor, a Jewish school, a Gentile school, and a Jewish council, and a Gentile council. And they managed it, and they lived side by side in perfect amity for years and years and years and centuries even. And my father grew up there, but he went to school to the gymnasium in Brno, which was near, and that's where he came across anti-Semitism the first time. So he started to learn about Jewish culture and Jewish history. he didn't come from an observant family. They were a very Jewish family, but they were not an observant family. And he began to really study Jewish history. So, not quite an ordinary man. And when he finished gymnasium, he went to Vienna to study law. And very early on, I believe the first week he was there, somebody called him a dirty Jew. And he challenged them to a duel, which was no longer legal. He was studying law. And my father had no idea how to hold a saber or whatever it was that they were doing. And he had his nose almost sliced off. And they rushed him to hospital, and he had the nose sewn back on. And it stayed on. But he had a most incredible scar right across his nose that it never went away. And I think he was quite proud of it. And he started at the university to teach Judaism, Jewish history, to other Jewish students. And one of those students was Teddy Kollek, who became the first mayor of Jerusalem. And when my father first went to Israel, Teddy Kollek acknowledged him as his first Jewish teacher. So my father, not quite an ordinary family, I suppose. And when the First World War came, my father volunteered to go into the army of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was very loyal to the empire. He was very loyal to Kaiser Franz Joseph. My father always told me when I was a child that royal heads of state were far safer than politicians. And so he volunteered for the army, and nobody really knows why or how it happened, but he was made into a lieutenant and put into the cavalry. He'd never sat on a horse. And there is a family photograph of my father on a horse, which really looks most peculiar. He was very soon taken prisoner of war by the Russians, and he was imprisoned in Siberia. And he was very kind of wanting to do things. And he had in his pocket something he carried always, a How to Learn English, Berlitz's book, a little book, Berlitz, how to speak English. So he learned English, and he taught everybody else English in the camp. And then he looked around for something else to do, and he loved chess. And so he made a chessboard out of some planks that they found, and they made chess pieces out of old bread. And he taught everybody to play chess. So I suppose not quite an ordinary man. And when the Russian Revolution came in 1917, they were free. The gates were open, and they were just left. There were no arrangements to get them home, but they were liberated. And it took my father a year and a half to get home. And somehow or other, he landed up in Vladivostok. And from there, he went to China. Not a most direct route home. And in China, he became very ill, and he collapsed. And he was found by a group of Chinese Jews. They looked Chinese, they spoke Chinese, they had long plaits, but they said that they were the descendants of one of the lost tribes. And they rescued my father, and they looked after him until he was well enough to go on. And 100 years later, my grandson went to China to teach English. He was there for a year. And he knew this story about my father. And so he tried to find this group, this Chinese Jewish community. And he found them. They no longer wear long plaits and they no longer wear kimonos, but they still look Chinese. And they didn't remember the story of my father. But they were very lovely to my grandson Saul. And they gave him, when he left, something that he then gave to me, and I have treasured always. And it's a Magen David that they make out of little bits and pieces, and they sell them. And that was the Jewish community in China that rescued my father. Now, so I expect you're beginning to see we were an ordinary family, but not quite ordinary enough. And when my father got back to Vienna, he went back to the university and he met my mother. And again, not quite ordinary, because she was studying chemistry, and one of the first women to study a science. And they met, they fell in love, they wanted to get married, but it meant that my mother had to choose, because she could either stay in the university and take a degree, or she could marry my father. Married women were not allowed in the university in Vienna. I'm glad to say that she chose my father, and I suppose they were, in the end, just an ordinary Jewish family living in Vienna. They were never very well off, because not everybody paid my father. But we had a comfortable home, and my mother was a wonderful cook. We had lovely food. We had warm clothes in the winter. We were content. We were a contented family. And I was an only child, but I had a cousin called Bubi. Well, Bubi is German for little boy, for those of you who know German. And we went on calling him Bubi even when he was a big boy. He was very kind. He was exactly a year older than me. He was an only child as well. So we sort of hung out together. We went on holidays together, the two families. We learned ice skating together. We learned how to swim together. We loved reading. We used to go to the library together. We played in the park together. And he was more like an older brother than a cousin. And he was exactly a year older, except for one day. His birthday was one day before mine. So we used to celebrate our birthdays together. And there was one birthday in particular that I remember, because I was given two very special presents. And one was a big doll, she really was big, called Susie. I called her Susie because that was my favorite name at the time. And I loved her because she had very kind brown eyes. I always thought that she looked so kind. And my other present, special present, was a very fine gold chain with a Magen David on it, and also in gold. And it was the first piece of jewelry, real jewelry, I'd ever had. So I was very, very proud of this fine chain with the Magen David on it. So you would say we were a happy couple of kids, except for one thing, and that was school. Okay, that's a picture of school, my first class. I started school when I was 6. That's when you start school in Austria. And there I am, standing at the back of the class, because I was a Jew. And the very first day when I got to school, I learnt how anti-Semitism felt, as well as what it meant, because I was called not only a dirty Jew, but all kinds of bad names. And racism always starts with names, with calling each other bad names. And I was called all sorts of names. And I was never included in anything at school that was fun. I mean, if there was an outing or a school play, I was always left out because I was a Jew. And of course nobody would play with me because I was a Jew. So I was pretty miserable at school. And then one day something happened that made it all a little better. And that was when a little girl called Gertie. Now you can see Gertie. There's a white blob on the left-hand side of the photo. Can you see that? White blob. And I didn't put it there, it just appeared. But it means you can see Gertie, because Gertie is sitting right behind the white blob. And one day, when I was standing in the playground at playtime, watching the other children play, Gertie came up to me and she said, "Do you want to play?" And I said, "Yes." We played, just like that. And then the next day she came up to me and she said, "Do you want to play?" And I said, "Yes," and we played, just like that. And then she started coming to my home to play. And Gertie became my very first friend. And one day I said to Gertie, "How come you play with me? Don't you know that I'm a Jew?" And Gertie said, "I don't care what you are, as long as you're kind. My mum says I don't have to do what everybody else is doing. My mum says I can stand up for what I know is right." Now, I don't know what you all think, but I think that Gertie and her mum were two of the bravest people I have ever met. Because it's very hard to do what you know is right sometimes, to stand up for what you know is right. It's much easier just to walk past, nothing to do with me, pretend you don't notice. Turn the other way. But they didn't do that. And of course, they put themselves at risk, because when Gertie started to play with me, nobody would play with her. And they started to call her names, like Jew lover. But even Gertie and her mum couldn't quite help me with, I suppose, the worst thing that happened at school, which was that every Christmas, about 10 days before Christmas, just before we broke up, somebody called St. Nicholas would come to the school. Now, St. Nicholas is the equivalent of Santa Claus. He's got a red cloak and white beard. And he used to come into the school with a great sack over one shoulder. And it was full of little toys, little things to give to the children who'd been good all year. And on the other shoulder, he carried a birch rod for all the children to be whipped who'd been bad all year. And he used to come into the classroom, and he used to go to the teacher's desk, and he'd put his sack on the desk, and he had the register. So he'd call out all the names of all the children who'd been good all year, and he'd give them each a little toy. And then, when they'd all had a little toy, he said, "And now for all the children who've been bad all year." And he'd call out my name. I was the only one left. And he made me come and stand in front of him. And he raised his birch rod. And then he never really hurt me. But he used to pretend to hurt me. And that made all the other children laugh. And worst of all, it made the teachers laugh. So I'm sure you can imagine that life for an 8-year-old child, as I was by then, at school was not a very happy one. I loved the lessons, but I hated going to school. And then something happened that, of course, made everything worse, and that was the Anschluss. I'm sure you all know that word. I have to explain it when I talk to school students, but it's when Austria and Germany joined together willingly, when Austria willingly joined Germany to become part of the Third Reich, Hitler's ambition to create an empire bigger and stronger than even the Roman Empire was, to last for 1,000 years. And then everything changed. All those Nuremberg laws and all the other laws that had come into being in Germany over 5 years, from 1933 to 1938, all those laws became law overnight in Austria. So that the very first day after the Anschluss, when my mother and I came to school, she was very wisely taking me to school. The headmistress was standing in front of the school gates, big gates, and she stood there and she said very loudly so that everybody around could hear, "Go away, you're expelled. We don't want Jewish children in our school anymore." And there was nothing my mother could do because it had become the law. And before the end of the first week, a Nazi lawyer commandeered my father's office, and there was nothing my father could do because it had become the law. And before the end of the month, a Nazi family came to our home and said, "This is our home now. You've got a week to get out." And that's what we had to do. So from then on, we were homeless. My dad was out of a job. I didn't have a school to go to. And we kind of stayed wherever we could. Somebody would put us up for a month. That was good. Or sometimes just a week, sometimes just a weekend. And we would often stay, and I remember for one long period, we stayed in a flat that had been abandoned by another Jewish lawyer who had managed to get out of the country and had just left the flat empty, and told us before she went that she was just leaving it. So we stayed there like squatters. That was good. And there were other laws. Jews were no longer allowed to participate in any public activities. I mean, we weren't allowed to go to swimming, weren't allowed to go ice skating, weren't allowed to use the library, weren't allowed to go to the park, weren't allowed to sit on public benches most of the time. Life got pretty scary because we never knew quite what was going to happen next. And one of the things that happened next was that we had to register with the Gestapo. Wherever we were, we had to register, even if we were just there for a couple of nights. And that was because the thuggery, the thugs of the Nazi party, the SA it was called, but they were real thugs. They used to come to places where they knew that there were Jews because they'd register. And they used to take the men, sometimes the women too, but most often the men, out of their beds, in the middle of the night, in their night clothes, take them into the street and make them scrub the pavements and clean the public lavatories. And very often with a toothbrush. Now, how humiliating was all that. And one day, they asked my not quite ordinary father to write Jude on a window belonging to Jews. They wanted him to write it in great letters in white paint, Jude, Jew, on the window. And my father wouldn't do it. And one of the SA guards, or whatever they were called, took him away. And my father thought he was being taken away. But in fact, he was taken home. And when my mother opened the door, this thug said to her, "I am so sorry. I have brought him home." And my mother said, "You're a good man." And what had happened was that this thug had once been defended by my father in court. And he had remembered it, and he had brought him home. But very soon after that, my father got himself arrested. Because after all the Jewish lawyers had their practice taken away from them, there weren't enough lawyers in Vienna to get the business done, because so many of the lawyers had been Jews. And they brought in a new regulation that Aryan lawyers could take Jewish lawyers as assistants in certain cases. And my father had a good friend who was a lawyer, who was not Jewish, who took him as an assistant. And one day my father was asked to go to court to defend not a Jew, a communist who had forged his passport. And my father said in court that in a country where you were persecuted not for what you did, but for who you were, forgery could not be deemed a crime. He was immediately arrested, and he was given a 6-week sentence in a proper prison in the middle of Vienna. And on the day he was supposed to come out, my mother went to the prison and waited for him, and she waited, and he didn't come out. And she couldn't get any information. And at the end of the day, she came home. And that evening was the pogrom on November the 9th, Kristallnacht. And we were staying at that time in a flat that had belonged to this lawyer that I mentioned before. And it was high up, I can't remember which floor, but it was high up. And we heard this eerie sound, and we went to the window, and we saw flames, and we smelled smoke. We didn't know what was happening. And we didn't know where my father was. And it went on for not one night, but 2 nights, 2 days and nights. And at the end of the 2 days and nights, my father came home. And he told us what had happened. He had been about to be discharged to come home when one of the prison guards went and got him. And instead of marching him out, he said to him, "Herr Doctor, terrible things are going to happen today, and you are more safe in than out. And I'm going to hide you, and I will let you out when it's over." And that's how my not very ordinary father survived. He came out 2 days later looking awful and thin, but he survived. Another good man, perhaps. And after Kristallnacht, although the world did nothing and perhaps could do nothing, but what happened was that they opened their doors just a little to let some of these Jewish refugees from Austria and Germany get into their countries. Previously, the doors had virtually been closed. Nobody wanted to know about these Jewish refugees. Nobody wanted to have strangers in their country. Just as today, nobody welcomed refugees. But now, after all this time, and my parents had been trying to get permission to go to another country from the day after the Anschluss, But now, how many months later, we began to be able to get visas to come to England. Now, it took a long time still for everything to be done, even when we had visas, because there were conditions. One condition was that they had to sign a paper to say they could only work as domestic servants. Another thing they had to do was they had to find a British citizen who would guarantee for each of us £50. It was a lot of money then. Somebody told me that for the three of us, £150 was about £3,200 now. He was a good man. I'm glad to say we never used his money. We never even met the man. But he was an English lawyer that my father could contact, and he did this for us. So that was the second condition. The third condition was that we had to put our names down to go to America. We weren't supposed to stay in England. We were only supposed to come to England to get out of Austria and be safe, but we were then supposed to go on to America. And America had a list which was called the quota list, and we had to put our names down on it, and we would be transferred to America when our names came up. So they did all that. They got guarantees, they got their names, our names on the list to go to America. And then we were allowed to take one suitcase each. And I was allowed to take one toy and one book. I've still got the book. It's a terrible book. I don't know why I chose it. It really is not a good children's book. It's nonsense. But I loved it, clearly. I chose it, I took it, and I've got it. And of course I wanted to take my big doll, Susie, but there was no way I could take her. She couldn't fit into a suitcase, and she'd have been squashed, or I wouldn't have had room for clothes. There was no talk about taking Big Susie. But Big Susie, luckily, that's it, thank you. Big Susie luckily had her own doll called Little Susie. And you can see how little she is on the next photograph. She's really tiny. And she was my doll when I was a child, and she was my children's doll. And she was my grandchildren, played with her. And I used to bring her to talks when I give talks to children in Beit Shalom in Nottinghamshire. And I used to hand her around and, let the children look at her. And the people in the museum got very anxious about her. And they said she was far too fragile for that, and that it was time she retired. So they put her in this lovely satin box and put her in the museum. And if any of you ever go to the museum in Beit Shalom, there she is. So we had our one suitcase each, and we were nearly ready to go, but there was one more thing we had to do, and that was go to a special office for Jews who were emigrating. And we had to have a red J, a big red J, as big as my hand, stamped on the front of our passports. J for Jew, of course. And we had to lose our names. We were no longer Haiti. I wasn't Haiti. I had to be Sarah. And all women and girls had to be Sarah. And all men and boys had to be Israel. It was a way of telling us, rather clumsily, I thought, that we were nobody. We had no identity. We were nothing. But I loved the name Sarah, and I was very, very happy, and I felt validated when my granddaughter was called Sarah. So, there we were. We were ready to go. and we were the lucky ones. It wasn't a nice journey. It took 44 hours to get from Vienna to London. You can fly in 2 hours now. We had to go on 3 different trains and a ship, of course. And every time we changed trains, we had to be searched, head to foot, real proper body search. And I was separated from my parents and searched, and I was scared. And they asked me something very peculiar that I didn't understand. They said, "Have your parents hidden anything inside you?" I thought, what? Didn't understand at all. And I said, "No." So we were on our second train, I think. Yes, it was the second train. When one of the women in the carriage, and the carriage was full of Jewish refugees, one of the women in the carriage boasted that she had managed to hide a lot of her jewelry in the lining of one of her garments. And my not so ordinary mother, but who had always been very quiet and composed, stood up and she shouted at this woman, "You're going to put all of us in danger. Get rid of it. Throw it out of the window." And all the other women joined in, and this woman with the jewelry got scared. And she ripped open the lining of whatever garment it was, I can't remember. And somebody opened the window, and we were going over on a railway bridge, over a river. And she threw all the jewelry out of the window. And I don't know what river it was, but as a child, I always thought it was the Rhine, and that there really was gold at the bottom of the Rhine. So we were exhausted and bewildered when we got to England, because we didn't know how we were going to live, where we were going to live, what was life going to be like. We didn't know. And as we got out of the carriage at Victoria Station, a porter came up to us, and he said to my father, "Help, help." And my father, in his thick accent that he never lost, he could speak English, but he never lost the accent, said, "No, thank you, no money." And the porter looked at me, and he smiled, and he said, "Never mind, miss, never mind." And he pulled out of his pocket a bright, shiny, 16-sided threepenny bit. And he gave it to me. And he said, "For luck in England, miss. For luck in England." And it was a wonderful moment. And for 85 years, I have kept the same threepenny bit in the same purse that I had when I was a child. Please. Oh, yes. I'll tell you about that in a minute. Can we go to the next one? Because then you can see the purse properly. There we are. And I've kept it all these years. And it was because it was a small act of kindness that meant so much. It meant welcome, it meant acceptance, it meant safety, it meant freedom, it meant maybe a home. Everything it meant to me. And, I never saw the guy again. I don't know what his name was. Maybe he gave bright, shiny threepenny bits to all the Jewish children arriving from Europe. I don't know. But I just know that it was a small act of kindness that was so important. And you all know who Nicholas Winton is. He organised the Czech kinder transport. Nicholas Winton once wrote, "Be not content to do no wrong. Try every day of your life to do some good. And you know, I think that's what the porter was doing. He was doing some good. So, we got to England. And everything. Oh, yes, would you like to, yeah, shall I just go back to that? I should have told you about that. Because the last thing we had to do for our passports is have new photographs taken. And that was my photograph, age 10, just a week before we came to England. And we had to have new photographs taken because the Nazis said that all Jews were criminals. And criminals, when arrested by the police, have to have a mugshot taken with their left ear showing. So you can see that my left ear is showing. And we all had to have photographs taken with our left ear showing. So there we are. So you can go on to the, there, thank you, stay there. Okay, so we were here. We were safe, we were free, and we were bewildered beyond belief. Everything was different. Every single thing was different. The weather was different. The food was different. The way people behaved was different. Not just the way they spoke. We knew that there was going to be a different language, but it was the way they spoke. We were all given a little book when we arrived about how to behave in England. And one of the things it said was, don't speak too loud. English people don't. And it was full of other little gems as well. But it was very, very different. Everything was different, just everything. And my parents, who were already older parents, could never get used to it. They never, ever got used to it. They always remained refugees, I suppose. They always felt like outsiders. They remained in England for the rest of their lives. They never, ever went back to Austria. They were loyal to England. They were grateful to England. They were naturalized to become British. We were all three naturalized. But we were told by the officer who did it, he congratulated us. He said, congratulations, you are now British. But you will never be English, he said. So that was confirming the fact that they always felt like refugees. My father was determined to be the best butler. I think he quite enjoyed it. He was just the best, you know. My mother wasn't as enthusiastic about cooking rabbit pie and jam roly-poly and all sorts of English things that she'd never cooked before. But for me, aged 10, it was quite different. I mean, I thought I'd landed in heaven when I went to school because everybody was nice to me. Nobody called me names. Everybody played with me. The teachers were just wonderful. I mean, they sat me at the front of the class so that I'd keep up with everything and they could keep an eye on me, and they gave me a list of new words to learn every day. They were just wonderful. I really thought I'd landed in heaven. And I absolutely fell in love with the English language. And my first two books, which the teachers gave me, which were Black Beauty and Little Women, I read and read and read. And by the end of the first year, all I wanted to do was to become an English girl. And we had our photographs taken at the end of primary school. And that's me, looking quite different, smiling even, plaits cut off, and being as near, I think, as I've ever got in my life to being an English girl. Now, I did say that I was going to tell you the story of two families. And the other family was Booby, my cousin, and his mum and dad, my uncle and aunt, and our grandmother lived with them too. So there were 4 of them, and it was more difficult for 4 people, especially with one who was old in those days, although she was only in her middle 60s, but she was considered old. It was much harder for them to get permission to go to another country than it had been for us. It had been hard enough for us. But they had almost managed to get everything together. They had got all the papers, they'd got the guarantee, they'd got almost everything to come and join us. There was just something they were waiting for. I don't know what it was. And the Second World War broke out. And the borders were closed. And they could no longer leave Austria or get into England. So they were really stuck. And they were taken to Terezin, the ghetto camp in Czechoslovakia. And from there, they were taken to Auschwitz, where my aunt was gassed on arrival. And Bubi and his father, my uncle, were then taken to Bergen-Belsen as slave laborers. And only Bubi survived. And as the Allies began to liberate the camps, the Nazis moved the prisoners from one camp to another on death marches. And Bubi was sent on a death march from Belsen to Mauthausen, the only camp in Austria. And he survived that. And he was unable to work. He was already very ill. And because he was unable to work, they sent him to yet another sub-camp called Gunskirchen, where they sent prisoners who could no longer work. And he was liberated from there. And the American officer who led the liberation of Gunskirchen wrote in his diary, and my friend and neighbor Charlotte is going to read you what he wrote, because I can't.
Row upon row of living skeletons, jammed so close together that it would have been impossible for them to move, even if they could have generated enough strength to do so. The place was crawling with lice. A little girl, doubled up with the pain of starvation, cried pitifully for help. A dead man rotted beside her. An English-speaking Jew from Ohio hummed, "The Yanks are coming," and then bursted out crying. A rabbi tripped over a dead body as he lifted his face to heaven. I could not understand what he said, but it was a prayer.
Thank you, Sean. So Bubi, forever Bubi, was one of those skeletons who could no longer stand. And he was taken to a nearby hospital, and he died there the following day, just 2 months before his 17th birthday. Now, he and my aunt and uncle, his parents, and our grandmother, they were not the lucky ones. They were 4 of the 6 million who were murdered. Now, when I talk to children, which I do very often, I say to them, what is 6 million? What does 6 million mean? It's words we use. 6 million, we say it. What does it mean? And I ask them to stand up. And I say to them, the late Chief Rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, once worked out that if we stood for 1 minute for each of the 6 million murdered, we would be standing here for 11 years and 4 months. And I think the children respond to that almost more than to anything else that I can tell them. I'm not going to ask you to stand up. But the children also say to me very often, but they weren't humans who did that, they were monsters. And I say, no, they weren't monsters. They were ordinary people like you and me. They were ordinary people who listened to misinformation, to fake news, to conspiracy theories. There was no social media, but there was radio, and there were newspapers, and it was unremitting. Conspiracy theories about the Jews, misinformation about the Jews, fake news about the Jews, all the time. That's how it happened. But they were ordinary people who did it. Ordinary people who were maybe having rough lives, and they needed somebody to blame, so they blamed the Jews. And the victims, the Jews, were ordinary people. They didn't do anything, they just were Jews. And the stand-byers, the people who stood by and did nothing, they were ordinary people. I suppose they were worried in case, if they said something, their families would become victims. They might lose their jobs. They were ordinary people. But there were ordinary people, like Gertie and her mum, who did not stand by. And I'm going to finish on a pleasant note, because Gertie and I got back in touch when we were in our mid-80s, and we've stayed in touch ever since. And last year I visited her in Vienna, and the last slide you're going to see is Gertie reading a book that tells her story. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Hedy. You said you didn't want to ask people to stand, but actually, I think I will. Some have been standing actually in admiration for you telling our story, and really the message that we always try to share, which is a number doesn't mean anything, and why it's so important to hear individual stories, and those 2 stories that you've shared with us. We have some names in our community that we're remembering as well. So I would like to invite people to stand. If you want a book, I'm going to grab a siddur just so that we can say Kaddish, either for the names that we are remembering and thinking of, or those countless numbers that we can't. Some of it people will know anyway by heart. But, I'm going to begin with the names that we remember as a community. So we're remembering Sonia Bayer and her family, Sorcha Bayer and her family, Scheindel Bayer, 3 great aunts of Belinda Milrod, and also Yehuda Yaakov Shilovitz, her great-grandfather, Luza ben Yehuda Yaakov Shilovitz, her great-uncle, and the Wagman family, her great-grandparents.
Can you write on Joseph Bell, please? Well, Joseph Bell.
We've got Bruno and Helen Cohn, the grandparents of Robert Wiltshire. Max and Ida Cohn, Martha and Louis Reisner. Heinz Ellie and Mattel Cohn, the aunt and uncle and cousin of David Reisner. And Ruth Reisner, David's aunt. Oscar Newman, the grandfather of Helen Reisner. David Eisenberg and his 3 children, Sarah and her 2 siblings, family of Susan Soloway. Laszlo Fleischmann, remembered by Jeff Hoffman. Taube Hyman, Heshka Zlati Jakobowitz, Zelda Jakobowitz, the wife of Jacob Jakobowitz, and the wife and children of David Jakobot, all the great uncles and aunts, family of Barry Hyman. Samuel Spitzer, Cornelia Spitzer, Johanna Spitzer, Regina Spitzer, Hugo Spitzer, Serena Weiss, Sandor Steiner, Rosalia Pressburger, Amalia Winter, Emil Winter, and Fritz Winter, and my own great-grandparents, uncles, and aunts who lived in Vienna. Jakob Seligman, Helen Neuhaus, her husband and son, and all other family members, the aunt and grandfather of Helen Hyde. Vera Nawrotsky, Shura Shtesin, Senia Shtesin, Tina Shtesin, Lydia Shtesin, and Aaron Zablotsky, and Esther Zablotsky, family of Simon Bloom. And the Bunus family, Cher family, Levine family, and Kantrovich family, connected to Brian Bloom, his family. Sidonia Frensdorf, Julie Berthold, Marta Rudolph, and Selma Bender, and Wilhelmina Heilwitz, the family of Anneliese and the late Edgar Bender, and of Helen James. As a community, we also remember the lost communities of Česká Budějovice and Vlasim, whose scrolls we care for. Hedy, your family and the stories that you've told for us today. So for all those we name aloud, for all those we name in our hearts, those who want to follow, I'll sing El Malei Rachamim on page 393, and then we'll recite Kaddish on 316. El Malei Rachamim shochen b'meromim hametzei menucha nechona tachat kanfei hashechina b'malot kadoshim utorim kazohar aki amazhirim לנשמות 6 מיליון אחינו ואחיותינו שמתו על קידוש השם ינוחו בשלווה ובשלום שלא ידעו בחייהם אנא בעל הרחמים הסתירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים וצרו בצרור חיים את נשמתם, אדוני הוא נחלתם, וינוחו ושלום על משכבם, ונאמר Amen. Kaddish is on page 316. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah Ba'alma divrach cherutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chay dechol Beit Yisrael v'galau v'zman kariv imru Amen. Yehei shemei rabba mevarach la'alam u'l'almei almaya yitbarach v'ishtabach v'yitba'a v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitada v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei l'kudisha berikhu la'ela min kol bechata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata Amiran be'amav imru, Amen. Yehei shalom rabba min shemaya, v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru, Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל העולם ואמרו אמן. Please sit down. I'm going to run away for 1 second. Straight back with a thank you. So just a big thank you, really, for coming and sharing your story with us.
Thank you so much. That's beautiful.
I'm going to suggest, I know, Hedy, you're willing to answer a few questions. Can I suggest if people want to go and get tea or coffee, and then really in literally 3 minutes, or it might take a little longer if everyone wants tea or coffee, we'll just take a comfort break for a couple of minutes, and then if people want to sit down again, we'll continue with an opportunity to ask questions for those who'd like to. Thank you again.
Right, thank you.
I watched you speak to your primary school.
Oh, have you?
Yes.
Yeah, I think Charlotte is getting it. Thank you.
Switching the glasses over.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll go live again for questions, so we'll go offline. So we'll go back live again for those who want to listen to questions separately.